Look, I'm not saying women can't serve. I'm just saying this isn't the place for her. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Rick Rhino Jensen's voice, a gravelly bark meant to convey authority, boomed over the engine roar inside the cavernous belly of the C-130 Hercules. The object of his condescension, and the sudden focus of 20 pairs of nervous eyes, was a woman whose physical presence seemed the very antithesis of his. Where he was a wall of muscle and scar tissue, a monument to his own perceived importance, she was compact, her frame lean and wiry under the bulk of her MC-6 parachute system and halo jump gear. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency, a silent ballet of practiced precision as she conducted her final gear checks, her gloved fingers tracing every strap and buckle with the intimacy of a surgeon examining a vital instrument. The crowd of special warfare candidates, all men built in Rhino's image, snickered. They were here for the final phase of their combat dive qualification, and the high-altitude, low-opening jump was the ultimate gatekeeper, a test of pure nerve. Rhino, their lead instructor, was the embodiment of that gate, a living wall of institutional skepticism. The woman, Master Chief Anya Sharma, didn't even flinch. She offered no retort, no defensive posture. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, remained fixed on her task. Her silence was profound, a vacuum that seemed to pull all the noise and bluster from the fuselage and render it meaningless. She simply continued her methodical check, her breathing calm and even a stark contrast to the anxious, adrenaline-fueled panting of the men around her. "Think you can handle a little wind, sweetheart?" Rhino pressed, stepping closer, his shadow engulfing her. He clearly mistook her silence for weakness, her focus for fear. Sharma finished her check on the en-bloc clip of her reserve chute, gave it a final, satisfying tug, and only then did she look up. Her gaze wasn't defiant or angry. It was utterly neutral, like a camera lens recording data. "I'll manage, Senior Chief," she said, her voice low and steady, each word clipped and precise, devoid of emotion. She then turned away, signaling she was done with the conversation, an act of dismissal so complete it momentarily stunned Rhino into silence. But from a dim corner near the cockpit access ladder, another man watched. Captain Elias Thorne, the commanding officer of the entire training facility, saw none of the things Rhino or the trainees saw. He didn't see a small woman out of her depth. He saw a stance, a posture of absolute stillness that spoke not of fear, but of a profound and unshakable calm, a centering of energy he had seen only a handful of times in his 30-year career, and always in the most legendary operators. He saw the way her hands moved, not with the nervous energy of a student, but with the fluid certainty of a master. He saw a professional at work, and in that moment, a seed of recognition, a flicker of a memory from a classified after-action report he'd read years ago, began to sprout in his mind. If you believe that true strength is measured in action, not volume, type competence in the comments below. The 10-minute warning call echoed through the fuselage, a sharp, metallic clang that jolted the already frayed nerves of the candidates. The massive rear ramp of the Hercules began to lower, revealing a breathtaking panorama of the California desert, a tapestry of ochre and brown from 30,000 feet. The air that blasted into the cabin was thin and brutally cold, a physical shock that stole the breath. Rhino swaggered down the line of jumpers, performing his final inspection with a theatrical roughness, slapping rigs and barking corrections. When he reached Sharma, he paused. "Let me give you a hand with that," he grunted, grabbing the pilot's chute handle on her main pack. His movements were deliberately clumsy, a show of patronizing force. For a fraction of a second, his thick fingers fumbled near the crucial retaining pins of her main parachute container, a movement masked by the general jostling and the bulky gear. He gave a final, hard tug on a strap near her shoulder. "There, all set. Wouldn't want you to have any trouble up there." His smile was a predator's grin, an ugly display of dominance. The other candidates saw an instructor being overly aggressive. Captain Thorne, still observing, saw something else entirely, a subtle, malicious intent disguised as professional oversight. He saw the slight twist of Rhino's wrist, the almost imperceptible snag he introduced into the system. Sharma, for her part, simply nodded. Thank you, Senior Chief. Her composure was a fortress. She knew her rig better than she knew her own reflection. She had packed it herself, inspected it 3 times, and had another master rigger verify it. Yet, as she stood, she could feel a subtle, infinitesimal shift in the weight distribution, a tiny point of tension that hadn't been there before. It was a discordance so minor that 99% of jumpers would never notice it. But to her, it was like a single sour note in a perfectly tuned symphony. Her training screamed at her to halt the jump, to demand a full reinspection. But her experience, honed in places where stopping was not an option, told her something different. It told her to register the anomaly, to trust her emergency procedures, and to proceed with unwavering focus. To cause a scene was to give the antagonist power. To solve the problem silently was to retain it. The jump master screamed, "Green light! Go, go, go!" The line of men shuffled forward and leaped into the abyss, their forms instantly swallowed by the vast, empty sky. Rhino jumped last among the students, turning to give Sharma one final, dismissive smirk before hurling himself from the ramp. Sharma stood alone for a moment, the wind whipping at her, the world spread out beneath her feet. She took one final, centering breath, and then she stepped off into nothing. The initial seconds of freefall were a familiar paradise of controlled chaos. The roar of the wind was a symphony of physics, the pressure on her body a comforting blanket of terminal velocity. Below her, the other jumpers were scattered like thrown dice against the sprawling canvas of the earth. She arched her body, a human dart carving a precise path through the thin, icy air, her mind a cold, clear calculator ticking off altitude, wind speed, and drift. At 10,000 feet, her internal altimeter chimed. It was time. She reached back, found a ripcord for her main parachute, and pulled. Nothing happened. Well, not nothing. There was a sickening, soft thud from her pack, but no blossoming canopy, no life-saving jerk of deceleration. Instead, a thin, useless streamer of green nylon, the pilot's chute, flailed impotently behind her, hopelessly entangled by the maliciously placed snag. It was a catastrophic malfunction, a jumper's ultimate nightmare. On the ground, 1,000 pairs of eyes watched through high-powered binoculars. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of support staff and trainees waiting at the drop zone. They saw the tiny, plummeting figure, the pathetic streamer trailing behind her like a failed party trick. No chute. Jumper in distress. The call crackled over the radios, a statement of the terrifyingly obvious. Medics scrambled for their vehicles, their faces grim. They were no longer preparing for a landing. They were preparing for a recovery. In the sky, Anya Sharma did not panic. Panic was a luxury, a foreign concept her mind had long ago purged. There was only the procedure. Her right hand shot to the cutaway handle on her harness, a bright red pillow. She pulled it hard. With a loud crack, the 3-ring release system disengaged, and the entire malfunctioning main canopy was jettisoned, flying away into the blue expanse. She was now falling clean, a human stone, accelerating back toward terminal velocity. The ground rushed up with terrifying speed. She had seconds. Her left hand moved with the same blinding speed to her reserve handle. She pulled. Again, the result was a horrifying failure. A small, tangled ball of white fabric emerged and was immediately caught in the violent turbulence of her own wake. The reserve chute, likely compromised by the same malicious hands that had sabotaged the main, was a knotted, useless mess. 2 failed chutes. An unsurvivable scenario. On the ground, Captain Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. He lowered his binoculars, his knuckles white. He knew. He knew what he'd seen on the plane, and he knew what he was seeing now. This wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder. Rhino, standing among the instructors, feigned a look of horror, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his own face. He had meant to scare her, to humiliate her, to make her fail. But this, a double malfunction, was a statistical impossibility. He had pushed a pin, not rewired the entire rig. He had created a problem, not a death sentence. Or so he had thought. He had made a fatal, arrogant assumption that his victim was just an ordinary jumper. The world held its breath, expecting the inevitable, brutal end. But in the heart of the storm, Anya Sharma was not falling. She was flying. Her body, honed by thousands of hours of flight time in wind tunnels and in the open sky, became a sophisticated airfoil. She flattened her arch, extending her arms and legs to catch the maximum amount of air, transforming her plummet into a controlled, forward-gliding descent. The ground was no longer a rapidly approaching wall of death. It was a runway, albeit one she was approaching at over 120 miles per hour. Her mind, a supercomputer of instinct and experience, was processing thousands of data points a second. Wind shear, terrain gradient, soil composition. She wasn't looking for a place to crash. She was looking for a specific, one-in-a-million topographical feature. And then she saw it. At the far western edge of the designated drop zone, there was a large, steep sand dune, its face angled at approximately 30 degrees. It was soft, its incline offering a potential, however slim, to bleed off her vertical velocity and translate it into horizontal momentum. It was her only chance. The trainees and staff on the ground watched in stunned disbelief. The tiny figure was no longer just falling. She was maneuvering, steering her body with impossible precision, tracking like a guided missile toward the dune. "What is she doing?" a young officer stammered, his voice filled with awe and confusion. Captain Thorne raised his binoculars again, his voice a low, reverent whisper that only he could hear. "She's not crashing. She's landing." The final approach was a masterpiece of controlled violence. In the last few hundred feet, she shifted her body, bringing her feet down and forward, preparing for impact like a swooping hawk. She was aiming for the base of the dune, intending to use the entire length of its slope as a brake. The impact, when it came, was not the sickening crunch everyone expected. It was a concussive blast of sand and kinetic energy. She hit the dune feet first, her legs absorbing the initial colossal shock. Instantly, she threw herself into a roll, a parachute landing fall executed at a velocity no human was ever meant to endure. She tumbled up the face of the dune, a blur of motion, rolling and rolling, shedding speed with every rotation, her body a marvel of conditioned reflexes, protecting her head and spine as clouds of sand erupted around her. For a long moment, there was nothing but a swirling vortex of dust and a deafening, absolute silence. The wind itself seemed to have stopped in shock. The medics, who had been racing toward the site, slammed on their brakes, their training utterly useless for what they had just witnessed. Then, as the dust began to settle, a figure emerged from the crater she had carved into the dune. It was Sharma. She rose slowly, first to one knee, then to her feet. She stood there for a second, a silhouette against the bright desert sun, then methodically began to dust the sand from her flight suit. Her movements were stiff, pained, but deliberate. She was bruised, battered, and most certainly injured, but she was alive, and she was standing. Rhino Jensen's face had gone from feigned horror to slack-jawed incredulity. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pasty, gray mask of pure terror. He hadn't just seen a skilled jumper survive an accident. He had just seen something that wasn't supposed to be possible. He had tried to kill a woman, and in response, she had performed a miracle. Captain Thorne didn't run. He moved with a cold, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. His eyes never left the figure of Rhino Jensen, who stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance. Thorne's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the stunned silence like a shard of ice. "Senior Chief Jensen, my office, now." The tone left no room for argument. It was not a request. It was a verdict. The two ranking master-at-arms, who had been observing nearby, understood the implicit command and moved to flank Rhino, their presence a silent, inescapable cage. The scene shifted from the sun-baked drop zone to the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the base command post. Rhino sat, or rather slumped, in a chair opposite the captain's desk. The bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind a sweating, trembling man stripped bare of his self-proclaimed authority. Thorne sat at his computer terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a quiet, lethal precision. He didn't speak for a full minute, letting the oppressive silence do the work for him. The only sound was the hum of the server racks and the frantic thumping of Rhino's own heart. Outside, Sharma was finally allowing the medics to examine her, though she had refused transport to the clinic, insisting on remaining as a witness. She was methodically documenting the state of her wrecked equipment, her focus as unshakable as ever. Finally, the screen in front of Thorne blinked, displaying a secured personnel file. The captain's face was illuminated by its cold, blue glow. He swiveled his chair to face Rhino, his eyes boring into the disgraced instructor. "Do you have any idea who you just tried to kill, Senior Chief?" Thorne's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to read from the screen, his words falling like hammer blows in the silent room. Name, Sharma Anya. Rank, Master Chief Petty Officer. Rhino's eyes widened in shock. She wasn't a trainee or a visiting officer. She was a Master Chief, a senior enlisted leader who not only outranked him, but was part of a rarefied world he could only dream of. Thorne continued, his voice devoid of emotion. Current billet, special assignment, Naval Special Warfare Command. Temporary attachment to this facility for curriculum assessment. He paused, letting the implications sink in. She was there to judge him. Unit of previous assignment. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the other officers present in the room. DevGru, the Tier 1 unit known to the world as SEAL Team 6. The quiet professionals, the ghosts who handle the nation's most sensitive and dangerous missions. Rhino began to shake visibly. Specialties, Thorne read on. Advanced Freefall Operations Master Instructor. High-Altitude Operations Subject Matter Expert. Covert Infiltration and Exfiltration. Close Quarters Combat Instructor. The list went on, a litany of skills that placed her in the top 100th of 1% of all military personnel on the planet. Combat deployments, 12. Combat hours, classified, but in excess of 5,000-inch. Thorne looked up from the screen, his eyes locking with Rhino's. Awards, Navy Cross. He let the name of the nation's second highest award for valor hang in the air. Silver Star. 3 Bronze Stars with V for Valor. 5 Purple Hearts. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. In her unit, she has a call sign. They call her, but it's Hindi for ghost, because for a decade, she was the ghost of Kandahar, the operator they sent into places so dangerous no one else would go. The landing you just saw? That's not a miracle, Senior Chief. That's a technique she invented after her C-130 was shot down over the Hindu Kush. She didn't just survive it. She perfected it, and she taught it. You didn't try to kill a woman. You tried to kill a living legend. The silence that followed the revelation was absolute, heavier than any physical weight. It was the sound of a career ending, of a reputation being ground into dust. Rhino Jensen looked like a man who had been hollowed out, his entire sense of self, built on a foundation of prejudice and bluster, utterly demolished by the quiet, undeniable truth. Captain Thorne leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of cold judgment. He gestured to the master-at-arms standing by the door. Senior Chief Jensen is hereby relieved of all duties and instructional responsibilities, effective immediately. Confine him to the base brig. He is under formal investigation by NCIS for attempted murder, aggravated assault, sabotage of military equipment, and conduct unbecoming an officer and a non-commissioned officer of the United States Navy. The master-at-arms stepped forward, their movements crisp and professional. On your feet, Jensen. Rhino rose like a man in a trance, his limbs clumsy and unresponsive. As they cuffed him, his eyes found Thorne's one last time, a desperate, pleading look. Thorne offered him nothing but contempt. As the disgraced instructor was led away, a broken man destined for a court-martial in federal prison, Thorne stood and walked out of the command post, back into the harsh light of the desert. He saw Sharma. She had finished her debrief with the investigators and was now standing alone, looking out at the dune, her arms crossed. Her flight suit was torn, and a large bruise was already darkening on her cheek, but she stood with an unshakable solidity. Thorne walked directly to her, the crowd of trainees and instructors parting before him. They watched, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and newfound, profound respect. When he was 3 feet from her, Captain Elias Thorne, a man with decades of command experience, a man who had led warriors into battle, did something none of them had ever seen before. He snapped to the sharpest, most rigid position of attention of his life and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture between officers. It was an act of profound deference, a public acknowledgement of her superior skill, her unwavering professionalism, and the deep institutional wrong she had suffered. It was an apology from the command itself. Anya Sharma, the quiet professional, turned to face him. Her bruised face was impassive, but her eyes were clear. She returned the salute with the same crisp precision she applied to everything. "Captain," was all she said. Thorne lowered his hand, but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly to address the assembled crowd, his voice ringing with an authority that was now tinged with humility. "Every one of you look closely. Let this be the first and most important lesson you learn at this command. Assumptions are a cancer. Arrogance will get you killed, or worse, get your teammates killed. You are here to be stripped of your ego and rebuilt as professionals. Today, you saw the living embodiment of that ideal. You saw the best. Do not ever, for the rest of your lives, forget what you saw here today." Dismissed, the crowd dispersed, but not before every single one of them, from the youngest trainee to the most senior instructor, made a point to walk past Master Chief Sharma, each offering a nod, a quiet word of respect, or a salute of their own. The tide of the culture had just been turned by the quiet competence of one woman. The story of the jump spread through the naval special warfare community with the speed and intensity of a flash fire. It wasn't an official report that did it, but the hushed, awestruck whispers passed from one operator to another. It became a piece of instant folklore, a modern myth whispered in the barracks at Dam Neck, shared over encrypted messages between SEALs deployed in undisclosed locations, and debated on private veterans forums online. The legend, as all legends do, began to grow with each telling. In some versions, she landed without a single scratch. In others, she disarmed the saboteur herself on the flight line. One particularly popular version claimed she didn't fall at all, but flew, guiding her descent for miles to land perfectly at the feet of the commanding officer. The truth, as those who were there knew, was infinitely more impressive. It wasn't magic, it was mastery. It wasn't luck. It was thousands upon thousands of hours of relentless, painful, obsessive training. Her survival wasn't a miracle. It was a demonstration of standards so high that most couldn't even comprehend its existence. The location itself became hallowed ground. Trainees started calling the dune the Ghost Perch or Sharma's Slope. It was no longer just a feature of the landscape. It was a monument to quiet professionalism, a stark, sandy reminder of the chasm between talking about being the best and actually being it. Rhino Jensen's fate became a cautionary tale of its own. His name became a verb among the instructors. Don't pull a rhino. It was a shorthand for letting ego and prejudice cloud judgment, for underestimating an opponent, for committing the cardinal sin of the professional warrior, believing your own hype. His court-martial was swift, the evidence against him, including the testimony of several trainees who had witnessed his malice on the plane, was overwhelming. He was dishonorably discharged and sentenced to 20 years in a military prison, a pathetic end for a man who saw himself as a gatekeeper of giants. Through all of this, Anya Sharma remained unchanged. The sudden, unwanted fame was an irritant, a distraction from the work. She deflected praise and resisted any attempt to turn her into a hero. A young, earnest SEAL candidate approached her a week later, his eyes wide with hero worship. "Master Chief," he stammered, "how did you do it? What were you thinking when you were falling?" Sharma looked at him, her gaze direct and analytical. She wasn't seeing an admirer. She was seeing a student who needed a lesson. "I was thinking about my training," she replied, her voice flat and instructional. "Gravity is a constant. The wind is a variable. The only thing you control is your reaction to both. Focus on your training. The rest is just noise." She then walked away, leaving the young man with a lesson far more valuable than any war story. She wasn't there to build her own legend. She was there to build better operators. The formal proceedings against Rick Jensen were a stark, clinical affair, a world away from the high-altitude drama that had precipitated them. The hearing was held in a sterile, windowless room at the base's legal center. Captain Thorne presided, his face an impassive mask of judicial authority. Master Chief Sharma was called as the primary technical witness. She took the stand and delivered her testimony with the same dispassionate precision she applied to packing a parachute. She spoke in technical terms, describing the nature of the dual malfunction, the specific points of failure in the main and reserve canopies, and the atmospheric conditions of the jump. There was no anger in her voice, no hint of accusation or personal grievance. She was not a victim seeking vengeance. She was a subject matter expert providing data. Her cold, factual recitation of the events was more damning to Rhino than any emotional outburst could ever have been. Her absolute professionalism threw his petty, malicious unprofessionalism into a harsh, unforgiving light. When it was Rhino's turn to speak, he was a broken man. He mumbled a rambling, incoherent apology, trying to frame his actions as a misguided attempt to test her resolve and uphold standards. He spoke of the pressures of his position, of the need to ensure only the toughest candidates made it through. It was a pathetic, self-serving performance. He tried to justify a deep-seated prejudice as a professional concern, and the board of senior officers saw right through it. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. His career was over, his legacy reduced to a single, shameful act of arrogance. In the days that followed, while the legal system ground Jensen's life into dust, Sharma's true character was revealed not in the air, but on the ground. She requested to remain at the facility for another month, not to gloat or to oversee the fallout, but to teach. She was on the flight line every morning before dawn, mentoring the same group of trainees who had nervously laughed at her expense. She worked with them on their gear, on their free-fall posture, on the psychological discipline required for high-altitude operations. She took aside the young candidate who had felt guilty for his silence on the plane and worked with him one-on-one, rebuilding his confidence not with praise, but with rigorous, demanding training. She was healing the wound in the command's culture by reinforcing the standards of excellence. On her last day, the trainees from that fateful jump approached her. They presented her with a small, simple brass plaque. They had pooled their own money to have it made. It was mounted on a block of polished wood. The inscription was simple, yet captured the entirety of the lesson she had taught them. DZ Ghost. October 18th competence is the only currency. She accepted it with a quiet nod, her first and only acknowledgement of the event's significance. The plaque was later permanently installed at the base of the dune, a silent, gleaming testament for all future generations of warriors. A year passed. The seasons changed over the Mojave Desert, but the legacy of that day remained, baked into the very culture of the training facility. The story of Master Chief Anya Sharma and the disgraced instructor Rick Jensen was no longer gossip. It was doctrine. The Ghost Drop, as it was now officially known, was the first story every new class of candidates heard on their first day. Instructors used the official after-action report as a case study in the dangers of hubris and the absolute necessity of judging colleagues by their performance, not their appearance. The brass plaque at the base of the dune gleamed in the sun, a mandatory stop on the initial base tour, a place for quiet reflection before the grueling training began. The impact was tangible. The new classes were different. The old school, chest-thumping bravado was slowly being replaced by a quieter, more focused professionalism. The instructors themselves had been humbled, reminded that the next unassuming student who walked through their doors might just be the most qualified person they would ever meet. And what of the ghost herself? Anya Sharma was gone. One day, she was simply not on the duty roster. There was no farewell ceremony, no formal departure. She had vanished as quietly as she had arrived, moving on to her next classified assignment in some forgotten corner of the world. She left nothing behind but a standard of silent, unassailable competence. Captain Thorne, now nearing retirement, often found himself in his office late at night, looking out his window toward the distant shadow of the dune. He had overseen the training of thousands of elite warriors, But the most profound lesson of his career had come not from a manual or a general, but from watching a 5'5" Master Chief fall out of the sky and refuse to die. He had since implemented what became known as the Sharma Protocol, a series of institutional changes designed to root out the very brand of prejudice that Jensen had embodied, a protocol that was being studied and adopted across the entire special operations community. True legacy isn't a statue or a medal pinned to a chest. It isn't a name carved in stone. It is the standard that is upheld after you're gone. It is the culture that grows in the space you cleared of poison. Anya Sharma left behind no monument, only a silence where arrogance used to be, and in that silence, a new generation of professionals learned to listen for the sound of pure competence. The ripples of that single, extraordinary event continued to spread, creating a lasting and fundamental change in the institution. The story became more than a cautionary tale. It evolved into a foundational myth, a piece of institutional scripture that defined the modern ethos of the special warfare community. It was a story about two kinds of strength: the loud, brittle strength of the ego, personified by Rhino Jensen, and the quiet, flexible strength of disciplined skill, embodied by Anya Sharma. One was a facade, designed to intimidate and dominate, but it shattered upon contact with real pressure. The other was an internal fortress, forged in the crucible of real-world experience, that grew stronger and more focused under duress. The narrative forced a painful but necessary self-reflection within the ranks, compelling leaders to question their own biases and to reevaluate how they identified and cultivated true talent. This Sharma Protocol became a new lens through which to view candidates, prioritizing psychological resilience, humility, and methodical consistency over simple physical prowess or aggressive posturing. The symbolism of the event was not lost on those who studied it. The sabotaged parachute became a metaphor for the broken, prejudiced ideology that had nearly cost a life. It was a system that had been deliberately compromised by its own gatekeepers. Sharma's impossible landing, her act of transforming a fall into a flight, became a symbol of the triumph of individual excellence over systemic failure. It was a demonstration that true competence is its own authority, capable of defying not just gravity, but ignorance as well. The salute from Captain Thorne was the final, crucial chapter. The moment the institution acknowledged its error and bent its knee, not to a person, but to the standard she represented. The lesson transcended the military, offering a universal truth. In any field, in any walk of life, there are those who talk and those who do. There are those who build their identity on titles and volume, and those who build it on a foundation of quiet, repeatable, undeniable results. Anya Sharma, the ghost, was a living reminder that worth is not claimed, but proven. Her legacy was not in the single act of survival, but in the enduring question she left behind for all who heard her story. Are you the noise, or are you the work? For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.